Hello, everyone. This is Mallory Flowers on behalf of Jennifer Shelf and Associates. We are coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Welcome to our webinar Wednesday series. Our webinars are held every Wednesday in 2018 at 12 p.m. and 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and our speakers range from accountants to attorneys and other industry professionals. The full schedule for the rest of the year is on our website underneath the webinar tab. In the interest of time, we do not take questions, and our speaker's contact info is posted on the last slide. So if you have any questions, please contact the speaker directly. The recordings are on the website underneath the Archive Webinar tab, as well as on our YouTube channel. Right, this just is a quick blurb about us. Jennifer Shelf and Associates is based in downtown Washington, D.C., and we help both product and service companies with federal contracting. Our clients are domestic and foreign, defense contractors and civilian, and our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles, including the GSA schedule. We can also help you with proposal writing and post-award contract administration. More information about our services and upcoming events can be found on our website. Right, so we're going to go ahead and dig into today's presentation, which is covering debriefs, what, when, how, and why. And our speaker today is Krzysztof Minarczyk. You can learn more about his background on this slide. Thank you, Krzysztof, for joining us today, and we go ahead and hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mallory, and thank you for everybody out there tuning in. So today we're going to be talking about debriefings, and my name is Krzysztof Minarczyk. I'm the owner of KrzysztofLLC.com, which is a company that provides expert advice in government contracts. A bit about myself: I used to be a federal contracting attorney. I also served a special rotation as a JAG acquisitions attorney in the Air Force, and now I'm primarily a consultant, an expert witness, and a professional instructor of government contracts. I'm also an attorney, and I should say that this is not legal advice and there is no attorney-client privilege. I also like to write about topics in government contracts, and you can email me for a copy of any of the articles that I've published in places like National Contract Management Association. So why don't we go ahead and get started? We'll go to the first slide, debriefings, the three dangerous Ds. So along with debriefings, the three dangerous Ds would include discussions, documentation, and also debriefings. Now, these are dangerous mostly for the government side, but for the contractor, they can often be opportunities, because when I say that they're dangerous, what I mean is that they're a great risk for the government. They're a great risk where the government may make a mistake and then they might lose a protest. So for the contractor, it's important to understand why these are a risk and how best to position yourself to benefit from discussions, debriefings, and documentation. So if we move to the next slide, documentation. A debriefing often hinges, a protest often hinges on the documentation surrounding it. So a debriefing is you sitting down with the federal government client and learning about how the source selection went, why you lost or won, how you were evaluated, how your competitors did. Now, a protest is when you formally file a protest at the Government Accountability Office or the Court of Federal Claims or at the agency, and you say that something was wrong with the source selection process and that maybe you should have been the one that awarded the contract. Well, it shouldn't surprise you that these protests, they're often decided based on the documentation available. So you could say, sure, that happened. Maybe it's true, maybe it's false. But what's really important is, do you have any documentation? Was that actually written down? Can you provide that to the court or to the GAO to prove your case? So that's why among my many clients in the federal contractor space, I always advise them to keep contemporaneous records. Now, contemporaneous records, that's just a fancy word for saying real-time memos, real-time documentation, real-time emails. It's always going to help you out when you're dealing with your federal contractor client, and also when you're dealing with your fellow contractors at the prime contract or the subcontract level. It's always going to be Very helpful for you to keep these records. So let me give you an example. Phone calls don't keep a record. So if you have an important phone call where you discuss things with the contracting officer or with a prime or a subcontractor, you want to immediately hang up the phone and write that down. You can do a memoranda to file, memorandum to yourself, to your superior, to your contracts manager, or you could just email yourself. That's what I like to do. Sometimes it's helpful to just email yourself and CC, carbon copy someone else that you work with. And then you can just keep an easy folder that has all the documentation. Things like that become just absolutely critical when you're trying to prove your case if you were to get into some sort of a contracts dispute or litigation or a contract protest or a contract claim. So it's not just about doing well in a debriefing. It's not just about doing well with your contract administration or submitting the right proposal. A lot of times you have to keep excellent documentation, and you want to make that a regular habit. So moving on to the next slide. Debriefings, what are they? Well, they're an explanation of why you lost most often. Although the winner, the person who actually receives the contract, they can get a debriefing too. But primarily, the people interested in the debriefing are the ones that lost the contract. Now, the goal of a debriefing, and again, a debriefing is a communication between you and the government about how that source selection went down. Why did you lose? Why did your competitor win? How were you evaluated? How did the government go through that process of selecting the winner? The goal, the actual goal of this, is so that you, the contractor, can submit a better proposal in the future. This is why the government offers these debriefings. This is why the government makes them mandatory in many cases. The idea is that it helps out both you and the government. You submit a better proposal. The government, in turn, gets better proposals, which means they get better price competition, better solutions, and they end up with a superior contractor. They want you to be able to improve, right? That's a win-win situation. So that's the lofty goal behind a debriefing. But let me tell you about what really happens in reality. Often these debriefings become what's called a fishing expedition for a reason to protest. So just like I said, the protests, they often turn on the documentation. Well, a lot of contractors use these debriefings as an opportunity to dig and tease out some information that would help them in a protest. So as you can imagine, these debriefings, they can be very stressful. They're mostly stressful for the government because the government is very worried that they're going to say or do or write down something in the debriefing that's going to give ammunition to you, the contractor, to ultimately win a protest. For instance, the government is worried about saying that they violated some procedures or directions that they said they would do in the solicitation, in the RFP, and then the contractor has their gotcha moment, and then they go back, they document that, then they're going to use that in a protest that they'll lodge against that federal contracting agency. So it can be very tense. It can be very stressful. There's a lot going on. There's high stakes in these debriefings. Moving on to the next slide. How do we actually conduct these debriefings? Well, the federal government can do it in any way they really want. It says right in the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the FAR, it says that debriefings can be done in person. They can be over the phone, like a teleconference. They can be written. They could be by United States Postal Service mail. They could be by email, which is becoming more and more common. The thing that you want to push for as a contractor, you're going to want the in-person debriefing. You're never going to get that same level of personal connection unless you have that in-person debriefing. You want to be able to read the contracting officer's facial expressions and those other people that are in the room. You want to see their reactions. You want to be able to have a one-on-one, real-time dialogue and conversation. But you are not entitled to that. Just remember that. You can always ask for the debriefing to be in person, but that doesn't mean that you'll get one. In my experience, when I was doing very large billion-dollar with a B contracts at the Air Force Space Command, for those very large contracts, the government, the Air Force, would often give the contractor an in-person debriefing because they felt that they owed it to them. If they're going to spend millions of dollars on that proposal, we felt that we owed it to the contractor to give them the time of day to have an in-person debriefing. But for smaller contracts, you might not get that. You might get an over-the-phone debriefing, or more likely, you might get an email debriefing where the government is going to email you the information required in the debriefing and maybe give you a chance to write back with a question here or there. The important part for these email debriefings is that the government cuts it off with finality, because the government does not want the debriefing to go on for days and days and days. Although you, the contractor, might want that, the government will want to be careful about sending you an email and saying, this concludes the debriefing. You know, they're going to usually send you something like that to say, okay, here's the line, it's over, the debriefing is now done. Please don't bother me anymore would be the subtext to that. Moving to the next slide, we have two types of debriefings. We have pre-award and post-award. Now, the most common debriefing is going to be the post-award debriefing, and you're going to find those procedures in FAR 15506. So you heard that you lost the contract, and now you're going to ask for a debriefing. That's the most common one. But there is another type of debriefing, the pre-award debriefing. That's where you learn that you were cut out, you were eliminated from the competitive range. Now, the competitive range is where they rack and stack offerers, and they decide, okay, these people are the ones that are possibly going to win this contract. And then they go through the process of discussions, which is really another term for negotiations, and they whittle down that competitive range. They're going to notify you before award, and they're going to say there once was a competitive range of 10, but we have limited the competitive range. We have cut you out of it. And now maybe there's only 3 people in the competitive range. At that point, you would be able to ask for a debriefing because you have been effectively told that you're not going to win the contract. But the more common debriefing would be post-award, when you formally learn that, okay, my competitor has officially won the contract. That's usually the one the contractor wants to wait to get, because if you think about it, if you wait for the post-award debriefing, that's when there's a lot more information, right? You want to wait for all the pieces to fall into place before you ask for your debriefing usually. So that's why it makes sense to use the post-award debriefing. Now, moving on to the next slide. Here's the section of the FAR 15506A1 that shows how a debriefing is mandatory. So an offerer, that's you, the contractor, after the written request is received by the government, within 3 days after you, the contractor, has received notification of contract award, you, the contractor, shall be debriefed. Okay, that shall means that it's mandatory, but the thing I want you to hone in on is that within 3 days after you've received notification, you need to ask for your debriefing. Within 3 days. If you don't ask for a debriefing within 3 days, it is not a mandatory debriefing. You lose your right to a debriefing, and the government will not have to give you a debriefing. So watch those timelines. Remember that you have to ask for a debriefing within 3 days. Next slide is going over a very important difference that the Department of Defense created with an official deviation from Defense Pricing and Contracting. Now, Defense Pricing and Contracting, DPC, that is the artist formerly known as DPAP. Okay, so DPAP is now called DPC. They issued a formal DoD class deviation based on a congressional law in the National Defense Authorization Act, which gave DoD contractors additional post-award debriefing rights. So again, this only applies when you're going after a DoD, Department of Defense contract. But great news for you contractors. You get an extra 2 business days to ask questions after a debriefing. So when they do that written debriefing by email, even after the debriefing is quote unquote over, if you're a DoD contractor, you get an additional 2 days to ask more questions. Now, this is intended to make sure that you get your money's worth in that debriefing. It's intended to force the government to answer that question that you ask up to 2 business days after the debriefing was already conducted. So good news for you. And generally, the government, the DoD, is supposed to answer that follow-up question within 5 business days. So this really does extend the timeline for you DoD contractors out there. This is really good news for you. So you can thank Congress for that by creating this additional benefit for you in the National Defense Authorization Act. Okay, so moving to the next slide, I told you that you have 3 days to request a debriefing after you've been notified that you lost. And if your request is late, then the debriefing is not mandatory. Now, the government they may accommodate a late debriefing request. They just don't have to. So why would the government do that? They would do that because they want to get a better proposal in the future. They would do that because they don't want to make you angry, because maybe you'll feel like they're hiding information from you, and then maybe you'll protest to get that information. So a lot of people in the government have a philosophy that a good, thorough and complete debriefing will lead to less protests, because then the contractor realizes, oh, okay, full transparency. I see what happened. There's nothing to hide. There's no reason for me to protest. All right, so moving on to the next slide, let's talk about what is required in the actual debriefing. This is all spelled out in FAR 15506D, the minimum. Now, there can always be more, depending on what the government wants to share, but the minimum, by regulation, states that the debriefing will include the significant weaknesses and deficiencies in your proposal. So that's definitely something that you want to know about. A deficiency is a weakness that rises to the level that means you cannot award to that contractor. So think of a deficiency as an absolute failure. That's a red light, no go, cannot award to a contractor who submits a proposal that has a single deficiency. And then the weaknesses are all other things. You can award to a contractor who has a proposal with many weaknesses even, or just a few weaknesses. But if there's a single deficiency, that proposal is unawardable. So you really want to pay attention to all those weaknesses so you can do better in the future. And you really want to know what deficiency you had, because that's a red light. That's something that you never want to make that mistake again. The government also must tell you the overall evaluated cost or price and technical rating of the winner, and also of you, the debriefed offerer. So that's very important information to know. You want to know what was the overall price and what was the overall rating of the winner, your competitor that beat you. That's very good information to have. Moving on to the next slide, some other important things you want to get out of that debriefing. The government owes you a summary of the rationale for award. Okay, so keep in mind, it's a summary. So the government does not have to give you everything and explain everything that they did, but the purpose of the debriefing indeed is to give you a summary of the rationale for award. How did the government arrive at this decision? What was the justification? What was the government thinking when they awarded to your competitor? Of course you want to know that, because you want to know how you can do better in the future and win that contract on the next time. The government also must provide reasonable responses to relevant questions. Now, again, this is reasonable responses. This isn't an entitlement for the government to answer every question you have. So when I get into debriefing strategy, I'm going to tell you about how to choose which questions to ask, because the government does not have to give you all the time in the world. You have to be very careful with what questions you ask, and just remember that you have to be respectful of the government's time, just as they're being respectful of your time. So moving to the next slide, debriefing strategy. consider who you bring to the debriefing because these things can be very emotional and tense. Think twice about bringing your attorney. If you bring your attorney, the government will bring their attorney, and it will be a very tense situation. People will likely be watching what they say. So think twice before you want to bring your attorney. And I'll tell you one thing to be very careful about. If you're going to bring your attorney, you should tell the government before the debriefing, because I've always advised people in the government that if the contractor should bring an attorney without telling you to the debriefing, you should cancel the debriefing and send them home and reschedule it, because that's kind of a party foul. You should definitely tell the government if you're going to bring your attorney to any particular meetings, especially to a debriefing. That's something that I always teach the government students, and I always teach the private sector contractor students whenever I hold a class on these topics. And then also consider who you bring, because if you bring that proposal manager who's a hothead and very emotional, remember it's their proposal that they're responsible for, that the government is going to be telling you, all the problems with it, how bad it was, how this section was wrong. So just remember, if that proposal manager or that person who's responsible for this effort, if they're not able to control themselves, they're not going to be helpful. So just think about that. Strategically, consider who you're going to bring. Bring the people that are calm, diplomatic, collected, organized, and professional. Next slide. The other thing I can tell you about debriefings. I've been to good debriefings. I've been to bad debriefings. The bad debriefings are where the contractors bring in whiners. Do not bring in and do not be a whiner. That's not helpful. Nobody cares. Let me just put this out to you guys listening. All of you contractors that lost the contract, nobody cares. Nobody cares. So whining to the government about the fact that you lost, nobody cares. It's a waste of time. You are there in that debriefing to get as much information as possible. You are not there to complain. You are not there to whine. That is useless. It will get you nowhere. It will only waste the government's time, and it will make the government have a very poor impression of you and your brand and your company. So be a professional. Don't whine. Don't complain. Try to get as much information as possible. That's what the debriefing is there for. That's what can really benefit you. Some things I've seen, some contractors ask very tricky leading questions. Now, a leading question is something that assumes a particular answer or fact. So let me give an example that the police would often use, or attorneys or something like that. They'd say, when did you stop dealing drugs? Okay, that implies that you were once a drug dealer. When did you stop committing these crimes? That implies that you committed the crimes. So a lot of contractors try to be tricky, and they'll ask a question like, so other than the FAR, other than the solicitation, what other methods and procedures did you, the government, use to evaluate my proposal? That's kind of a tricky question, because the answer should be, we used nothing other than the FAR and the solicitation to evaluate your proposal. If the government answers in any other way and they say, well, we used X, Y, and Z, they're potentially giving you the ammunition for what's called a unstated evaluation criteria, right? All the evaluation criteria must be spelled out in the proposal. If you can get the government to trip up and say that they used something they didn't put in the solicitation, well, that's an unstated evaluation criteria. So that's a tricky leading question that I've seen from many of the large defense contractors. But your objective in the debriefing is to get as much information as possible. And always remember that. So moving on to the next slide, there's something called the SECA stay, or the freeze. That's where if you protest within 10 days after award, or within 5 days after a mandatory debriefing date offered. Now remember, I went over what a mandatory debriefing is. It's when you ask within 3 days. So just keep this timeline in mind, because the SECA stay is very powerful, especially for an incumbent contractor. If you're the incumbent and the contract is frozen, let's say your competitor wins, if you protest within this timeline on this slide, then the contract is automatically frozen and the government cannot move forward and cannot award it to your competitor that they selected. Well, if you're the on-site incumbent service contractor, guess who's getting an extension to the contract until the protest is resolved? You. For that reason, it's very important to know this timeline, and here's my advice to you. You have 3 days to ask for a debriefing. Given that I told you that this SECA stay or this freeze timeline is 10 days after award or 5 days after a mandatory debriefing date offered, it makes sense to you in a strategic way to not immediately ask for a debriefing right after you've been notified. Strategically, purely on a strategic level, it makes sense for you to wait until the maximum 3 days to ask for that debriefing. Why? Because that extends this timeline, and it maybe gives you more than 10 days after award because it pushes out the government's timeline for when they can offer a debriefing. So think about that, and feel free to contact me about that strategy. It's something that I've taught for years. Moving on to the next slide. A lot of my clients, they ask me, well, I won the contract. Should I ask for a debriefing? The answer is yes. You might want to do that. Just because you won the contract does not mean your proposal is perfect and does not mean that you have nothing to learn. So the winners often ask for a debriefing, and I would recommend that you do as well because it's a learning experience. Can you control the format of the debriefing? No. You can ask for an in-person debriefing, but the debriefing is totally controlled by the government contracting officer. It is up to them. Do you need to prepare for a debriefing? Big question I get from my clients. Absolutely. And that's something that I often help my clients out with is preparing for this debriefing, writing up the questions, going over the proposal, looking at the solicitation again. You absolutely should be preparing for a debriefing because it's a very important moment for you to learn about how to win that contract in the future. Moving on to the next slide. A lot of my clients ask me about reading the government's behavior. Well, it's like fortune telling and reading the tea leaves. A lot of people have a theory that if the government's nervous, not confident, if they're unprepared, if they're evasive, if they're holding back, well, that means we should protest, right? Because they're holding back information, they have something to hide. Well, I'll just say that is definitely not a 100% certainty. Think of it like a lie detector test. Maybe the person is just nervous. Maybe this government contracting officer has never done a debriefing. Maybe that's why they're not confident and nervous. You can never really tell. So moving on to the final slide, I put my email up there. It's Christoph@christophllc.com. Feel free to email me about these topics of debriefings, how to write better proposals, how to deal with the contracting officer, and really any other topic in government contracts. So with that, thank you very much for tuning in. I'm Christoph Minarchek of ChristophLLC.com. I'll turn it back over to you, Mallory.
Thank you so much, Christoph. Thank you for sharing your time with us today, and thank you for everyone who joined us. Like he said, if you have any questions for Christoph, please contact him directly with the information you see on your screen. And at 12:30, we are covering What's Your Values Proposition. This concludes our webinar. Thank you, everybody.